Welcome to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant Interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in who gets funded? Become a HAPS donor today by visiting www.hapsfund.com/donate. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I am Megan Lewis, and we are continuing our HAPS interviews today. If you are new to the channel, you don't know what HAPS is, the website will be ticking along the bottom of the screen as we talk, so you can go and check it out. But I am joined by Benjamin today. Hello, Benjamin. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well.
And do you prefer Benjamin?
Let's stick with Benjamin, just so nobody gets confused if they join midstream.
Perfect.
Folks know me as Ben as well, but so I don't take offense.
Well, it's lovely to have you. Would you mind introducing yourself, telling everyone who you are, where you're from, and what your speciality is?
Absolutely. Benjamin Starr. I am in my fourth year of a PhD in the Department of Religion at the University of Georgia. U.S. state, not country. Because I know you have a lot of folks international. And so we're particularly in the Department of Religion, but my focus is in the Hebrew Bible. And my specific, I'm entering, because I'm in the fourth year, I'm in my dissertation phase. And so I'm writing my dissertation on the book of Jeremiah.
Can I ask, what was it about Jeremiah that made you want to write a dissertation on it?
One, I think there's constantly an ebb and flow of scholarship in the way people, what people focus on. So things get hot from time to time, and I think we're kind of riding into. I mean, there's just some interesting dissertations now emerging, interesting writings emerging now on Jeremiah. It doesn't help or hurt that when your advisor is also working on Jeremiah as well. I knew that I wanted to focus on prophetic books coming into grad school, just because I think they are a unique and potentially the most misunderstood part of the Hebrew Bible. I know that's a big claim to make. There's a lot of misunderstandings about the Hebrew Bible, but prophetic literature, I think, just had a certain attraction, both because of how culturally resonant it is today. In today's public discourse, people invoke notions of prophetic figures. And of course, there's that common notion. I was speaking with someone who especially was in religious anthropology the other day, and we were talking about dissertations, and his comment was, where do we get over that hump of people thinking about prophecy being future forecasting? And most folks that are pretty embedded in the Hebrew Bible world know that that's only a portion of what the prophets are doing. So I think it's just fascinating literature. And I think it's also just some of the most significantly innovative literature that we see come out of the ancient Near East, in terms of how they use metaphor, how they use their own context to really develop these incredibly persuasive messages to their hearers. We don't necessarily know how persuasive they were. In fact, the writers of the Hebrew Bible would probably argue they didn't persuade enough. But still, it's just such resonant literature that I just am attracted to it.
Thank you very much. Are you focusing on a particular set of passages in Jeremiah, taking it from a particular angle?
Absolutely. All you have to do is dip your toe in Jeremiah and realize this is a mess. It's not chronological. You can't put. There's so many of our Western expectations about literature that stepping into Jeremiah, you just punt that. It's not chronological. It is, of course, if anybody knows the difference between the Masoretic, that's the Hebrew text of Jeremiah, and the Greek text that's in the Septuagint, they're significantly different. The Greek text is significantly shorter, so you do have to kind of know, well, where are we going to hone in on? I'm looking at what I call early Jeremiah, chapters 1 through 25. Most scholars view there to be some real authentic Jeremiah oracles in that, and I tend to agree with him. Specifically, I am working right now in chapters 2 to 4, because this seems to be earlier in Jeremiah's career, and he's has this great interplay between how he's talking to the people in Judah, in Jerusalem, in his own context, and then referencing their sister Israel, looking back into this historical memory of Israel and what's happened. Israel at this point has been carried off to exile by the Assyrians. They have sort of become the paradigm for apostasy in ancient Israelite religion, and now Jeremiah is using that, which is, some decades afterwards. Most people probably didn't experience that themselves, but may have. There's all of these interesting things about how the memory of Israel is kind of bubbling up in Judea's identity.
That sounds really interesting. Are you how do you see your dissertation and your work kind of building on what is currently out there for studies of Jeremiah?
As I said, there's some very good work going on in Jeremiah, but there's also a lot of baggage because people have been doing biblical. I mean, this is sort of the question of when
Yeah,
people,
it's a fact.
yeah, would be like, oh, hasn't everything been written on the Bible? And I'm like, yeah, but a lot of it's wrong. Um, hence humans against poor scholarship, right? Um, there are just ideas that float out there that are many times unchallenged. I think one of those ideas that I'm really going to push back against is this notion that there are sometimes countless layers of redaction in the material. People will find these very minute fragments and kind of go, oh, well, this is a redaction here. This is something that the exilic community has inserted. This is something the post-exilic community has inserted. I think that can sometimes become pretty problematic because, for one, many of the people who argue this don't put forward what I would call good evidence. Sometimes it does elide into these sort of, well, this sort of is obvious, and therefore they don't get the evidence. Or they'll make it strictly an ideological argument that this represents a exilic theology, this represents a post-exilic theology, and I think that leans towards the subjective. I think that leans in towards if you read this from a different angle, you may very well be wrong. Is there a way to have a more formal, systematic way of going about identifying how these pieces fit together? What is not necessarily original, but what's within the stream of thought? And so I'm approaching this kind of from what some people call a discourse analysis approach or text linguistic approach to look for distinct markers of, okay, here's how we know the writers are signaling to their audience to read this as a unity. And I am hopeful that I can find better evidence for unity in places that people have typically found fragmentary.
So if we're thinking about redactions and that kind of textual transmission, what kind of evidence ideally, and I realize this is possibly a little far outside of what you're doing,
Right.
but what kind of evidence ideally would we want to make a strong argument to say, oh, this is a redaction, or no, this is
Mhm.
part of what came before?
I think the first is to get as many possibilities as are reasonable on the table. Um, what discourse analysis has done, and most of the work you'll see on discourse analysis or text linguistics, if you look at the folks that are writing on that now, it is very focused on narrative in the Hebrew Bible. And it is focused on, which I think is a very rich area. And that's one of the things that really inspired me to do this, to see people focusing on the Bible as a literary form and thinking, okay, how is the author foregrounding, backgrounding information? How do they bring in a parenthesis? How do they make an aside? How do they speak, sort of break that fourth wall? And there are ways of doing that. There are ways of signaling that redactions have been inserted. Some people of your viewers may know the Wiederaufnahme, we use German because so many biblical scholars, but it's just the resumptive repetition. When you see a phrase that's stated, and then later on it will be stated again, that's just a signal to the audience that somebody has come in and maybe added some additional information. They could have put it in the margin, but they chose to put it in the text, and this is their way of signaling. So we can trace things like that. Really, the verbal system is something I think we're increasing in knowledge about, that just from cognate literature and just close readings, to begin uncovering that there are ways that the Hebrew writers are going to use verbs to lead their readers in one direction or another, and try to expect that, okay, this is proceeding in this way, or we're going to make a break here and transition to a different subject. Yeah, and there's discourse markers. I mean, that's something that's been well worn about what discourse markers look like in the Hebrew Bible to signal either, hey, somebody's speaking here, or I'm going to give you a quick summary of what was said here. So we just need to attune ourselves to those things, because I think the biblical writers are intentional about putting them in.
Thank you. I probably should have asked this question a couple of questions before. Can you just give like the briefest explanation of what discourse analysis is?
Discourse analysis is moving from, we're familiar with grammar, how a subject and a verb and an object all work together. You know, even if we don't have formal grammatical training, we know, speaking English, that the dog bit the man is a different sentence than the man bit the dog, right? We kind of go, well, because man came first, and because English is a very syntax-oriented language, we can innately discern that. A lot of linguistics, particularly biblical linguistics, sometimes stops at that level. Discourse analysis is moving to the next level. You may have an imperative in a sentence, and in your elementary Hebrew, you learn that you have an imperative in a sentence, a command, a directive. The next verb isn't necessarily that same force, but it carries that force. It may not be the same form. It may be just a future form. But now we're going to carry that imperative force. And so it starts bringing that up to instead of from clause to clause, just treating these as discrete units. We're moving up to the larger and kind of going, okay, this may be a full discourse from Jeremiah 2, whenever he begins his discourse there, all the way through. I think about, the beginning of chapter 4, it seems to be a continuous speech, even if there is a turn in posture, a change in voice, a change, and the discourse is going to look at the full chunk, not just smaller units.
Okay, thank you. And I assume that this is not, historically speaking, been a common way to approach the Hebrew text.
It has been emerging more. And of course, I mean, as every field develops, and of course, as biblical studies is very interdisciplinary, we often find ourselves some years behind what maybe a department of linguistics is doing. And so we kind of have to catch up. We kind of have to want to make sure that we're not just using someone else's arguments from another field and carrying them in very ham-fistedly, just carrying them in to maybe affirm our presuppositions. We want to be responsible about how we're using these things, and knowing that just as we have conflicts in our own field, there's also conflicts in other fields. And so you kind of go, there's some people that may look at what I'm doing and go, well, you're doing that wrong. I just want to make sure that as I'm doing this analysis, just like somebody may be doing conversational language in a immigrant community that has now lived in all sorts of different contexts where language can kind of change and morph and carry a lot of different unstated or unspoken baggage with it. I want to make sure I'm doing the same responsible work in the biblical text, using those methods.
Thank you. Just a reminder for the people viewing, if you have questions for Benjamin, please put them in the chat. I will relay them as long as they arrive before we move on to our next person.
Or if you have an expert in text linguistics that wants to, maybe coach me on that.
Have a chat, then just email me and I'll put you guys in touch. So what are your summer plans then, and how would HAPS funding help you with that?
So there's the pivot. My summer plans right now are to go to tel-Shimron in Israel and dig. And just so you know, I don't expect to find any text there. But here's another part of my philosophy on biblical scholarship is our propensity to bury our noses so far in the text sometimes make us forget that there's a world that produced this, that they are writing towards people who have real lives outside of the temple, outside of the sacrificial system, who may have contrary ideas, who are interacting with all the groups around them. And I think it's very important for biblical scholars to have if not a specialty, at least to be able to be conversant in archaeological methods, because we can't interview these people. We can't do direct ethnographies. We have to build with much less data what their real lives were like. Tel Sharon is a site that I particularly picked because of, I think, the quality of its staff and the orientation they have towards getting people to understand. It's just an educational model of getting people to understand archaeology in a very good scope, not as specialists, but to understand that that mound is a text like I'm looking at, and we have to make interpretive decisions as we go in there, and we have to bring evidence as best we can from that tell, and try to bring it into conjunction with what we're doing in the text.
It sounds like a fantastic dig to go on, and I wholeheartedly agree. Assyriology suffers from, or has in the past, I think things are changing, but a similar propensity to, there are text people and there are archaeologists, and never the twain shall meet, which is not always the best practice. As you're in a religious studies department, have you been able to take archaeology classes, or will this be one of your first exposures?
So I have I have been exposed to archaeology just by virtue of my advisor, Drew Copper. It was at Tel Megiddo for many years, and so he's been able to sort of train me on the side. Most of our archaeology here in the southeastern United States is centered on New World archaeology. It's very focused, particularly in sort of Native American. We have our own Indian mounds here in the United States, as they're called, that we have no texts, and so archaeology takes on a different form here. The focus but the principles stay the same. I haven't been able to do as many of those things as I would like to do. And now it's sort of, well, we could stay in school forever, or we could get the practical experience in the field and then actually write the dissertation. It is something that needs to be a continuous part, because technology is changing so rapidly. I think it's going to affect archaeology significantly in the future as well. So yeah, I haven't had as much opportunity as I'd like, but there are so many hours in the day, and there are so many days in the PhD that we can spend.
Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for that. As a PhD student, there's so many interesting things that you could and would like to learn, but A, you have to sleep and eat, and B, there are literally only so many hours in the day, and you do have to decide what to prioritize. So I completely understand, and I hope that we'll be able to help you with your summer plans. We don't actually have any audience questions. Is there anything that you wanted to share with us before I let you go?
The one thing I have mentioned, as I mentioned about Tel Sharon, you don't have to be a PhD student to go do archaeology. That is one of the things that, as I've been talking with people, telling them my summer plans, they've just been like, "Whoa, you get to do that?" And I'm like, "Yeah, and you can too." And so that is something. I know your viewers are interested in this world. It's a phenomenal experience. You don't have to go to Tel Sharon. There's a lot of resources you can look at to do these sorts of digs, and I completely, for an educational experience, find it unparalleled. And you don't need to be a specialist to do it.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a delight talking to you.
Absolutely.
Best of luck. I hope the rest of the semester goes well. I know things are starting to wrap up now.
I'm going to go grade some papers right now.
Good luck with that.
Thank you.
I'll be in touch at the end of the month to let everyone know what's going on next.
Very good.
Thank you, Benjamin. Bye. That was Benjamin Starr. He's working on prophetic texts in the Hebrew Bible from a discourse analysis perspective, which is fascinating because I have not actually had any exposure to discourse analysis. So I am a little bit more educated now than I was 20 minutes ago. We do actually have our next guest ready and waiting to go. So rather than turn off the stream and make you all wait for 10 minutes, we are just going to get going. So Chandler, hello, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me, Megan. Nice to see you.
You too. Could you please introduce yourself, tell everyone who you are, where you're from, and what your speciality is?
Sure. So my name's Chandler Collins. I am studying at Bar-Ilan University, which is in Ramat Gan, Israel, just outside Tel Aviv. I'm not there now, but that's where I'm doing the program. The program is in Hebrew Bible, and yeah, I'm in the PhD. I'm in I think the third year of the program now, and so I'm working as hard as I can on my dissertation.
What is your particular research interest or speciality?
So I am looking at the physicality of Jerusalem and its impact on the Hebrew Bible. So I lived in Jerusalem for the better part of 5 years, first as a student and then working on staff at the Jerusalem University College on Mount Zion. And seeing the city every day, living and walking in it, and seeing the contours of the topography, I became really interested in the way that the physical city itself shows up in the Hebrew Bible. And my particular focus of research is maybe the 7th century BC, early 6th century, and perhaps the late 8th century. So we say Iron Age 2, B, and C. And during that time period, there was a shift in the city where a high hill known as the Western Hill, or today Mount Zion, became occupied. And it wasn't previously occupied, say in the days of the early Judahite kings, maybe back in the time of David and Solomon, for instance, in the kings following them, however we understand that historicity, but 10th century. So this higher hill in Jerusalem, the Western Hill, becomes not only occupied, but walled in and a part of the integral city, and dwarfing the temple and the royal quarter. And so my research looks at this kind of uneven city as far as what I think of ancient Near Eastern urban planning, and sort of how that strange dynamic might have impacted the way that the city is described, or the way the biblical writers relate to it.
Thank you. I have several questions because this is fascinating. So Jerusalem is obviously still an occupied site there. It's an archaeological historical site, but there are also people very much living and working there.
Mm-hmm.
How are we able to understand the topography of the city, the layout of the city for the time period that you're looking at, given that we can't just go and excavate the whole site?
Yeah, and there's a whole host of, humanitarian and political issues, right, that are involved in this as well. So I want to be sensitive to all of those. And as far as the archaeology of the city, it's difficult to do in a lot of places because there's such dense, built up of urban tissue. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, and hasn't happened in the past. So the city's been excavated for something like 170 years, into different degrees of quality, right? Especially in those early days. But today, most of what happens in Jerusalem is what's called salvage excavations, where during the planning of building of infrastructure, when the foundations are being dug, there'll be an excavation that happens to kind of clarify things underneath the bottom of the structure. In some cases, the excavations are more connected to tourism development. That's kind of what you have happening in the ancient core, and some of your listeners will know the controversy surrounding some of the excavations there. But in terms of more broadly what you're trying to get at with your question, the evidence is spotty, and we have details of one area of Jerusalem or one area of the ancient core, and then kind of a blank space, and then we'll have another piece of evidence over here. And so you really have to work to connect the dots as best you can, and recognize that one excavation can't really speak for the whole of Jerusalem. Some archaeologists have made the mistake of reading their excavation area into the rest of the city, and may or may not say anything about developments in other areas of Jerusalem, because it's been built and rebuilt so many times. And later builders dug foundations down to bedrock in a lot of cases, which destroyed earlier evidence. So it's complicated. Yeah.
I also want to just mention for viewers who might not be familiar, my question may give the impression that we have less information about Jerusalem as an archaeological site than we do for other ancient Near Eastern sites. I'm not familiar with the archaeology of Jerusalem, so I'm not going to make that statement, but it's also very rare to excavate an entire archaeological site, right? Because it's expensive,
Right.
it takes a very long time, and archaeology by its nature is a very slow, careful, methodical process. So having little pockets of information of specific areas is actually very, very common. So this isn't, I wouldn't say that this is a rarity among archaeological sites. Are you trying to tie it to, or trying to tie this topographical study to a specific aspect of the Hebrew Bible, or are you purely focusing just on the archaeology?
So my dissertation sits at the intersection of text, in this case, Hebrew Bible, archaeology, and geography. And, the field is known as historical geography. So I'm trying to, as best I can, understand those three lines of evidence as they relate to Jerusalem in the 8th, 7th, and early 6th centuries, just before it was destroyed. The city was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And to understand what those lines of evidence can tell us about the nature of the city. The Bible at large seems to, although it was composed during the time period when this uneven city that I described to you existed, it doesn't really seem to comment on the western hill of Jerusalem that was overshadowing the temple and the royal quarter. And that in itself may be a form of polemic, kind of ignoring the landscape. But it could be that the Bible does comment on it in some ways, but we just haven't understood that, or it alludes to it somehow. And there were some excavations in the 1960s and in the decades following, that sort of wrote the book on the Western Hill of Jerusalem because it hadn't been excavated before in any extensive manner. And so I think most people kind of took the conclusions of those excavations and ran with them. What I'm doing is kind of trying to re-examine them and re-examine the biblical text, because we have a lot more data now, in the decades following those excavations.
Thank you. What implications did building up the Western section have for social structure, political, religious infrastructure, thought, power dynamics? Is that something that you've explored yet?
That's that's kind of sort of how I want to get to the conclusion of the study. Those are topics I'm interested in pursuing, but it takes building up the data of what do you actually see in the dirt in the Western Hill. One of the prevailing theories is that the Western Hill was occupied only after 722 BC or BCE, when Samaria was destroyed by the Assyrians, or in the decades following that, as you began to have Assyrian incursions into the southern Levant. And so what that produced was a wave of refugees that fled down to Jerusalem and occupied the Western Hill, and the city really balloons into this metropolis, which then gets walled in. Recent studies are suggesting that that probably was not the case. And we know that the Assyrians managed their, deportations and refugees from campaigns pretty closely. So what I'm also trying to consider is the possibility that this hill grew incrementally over time, may have been added to by refugees, et cetera. But it disrupted the power dynamic in terms of the way Jerusalem was designed to be structured, with the temple and the royal palace in the Acropolis of the city. And so whether it was refugees on the Western Hill, or whether it was a mix of lower class people and more affluent people, we could see in the material culture maybe. The question is, what did this newly occupied hill do in the mind of the elite of Jerusalem? And we have some evidence actually that there are some royal and administrative structures that have been unearthed south of Jerusalem, in the area between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, that may suggest that the kings or elite of Jerusalem, in fact, ignored the Western Hill and chose to build elsewhere, to build their royal villas or administrative buildings south out of the historic basin. So that's something I'm also considering as well. What you see in the text of the Hebrew Bible and also in the archaeology.
That's really interesting. And am I right in assuming that the Western Hill is primarily domestic architecture?
Yeah, we don't see some of the more luxury material that we see in the ancient core, where you have imports. For example, there was a wine jar that was recently tested, and in the residue analysis, they found evidence of vanilla, which is, had to come from quite a ways away, and it suggests extensive trade routes. That was found in the ancient core. But on the Western Hill, we tend to find buildings that are not well built, small walls with stones that were not well shaped into, what we call ashlar blocks. And there's not a lot of evidence of urban planning or anything like that that I found. So one possibility I'm trying to explore is that maybe the Western Hill was part of the early agricultural hinterland of Jerusalem, and that was part of the initial excitement to, develop it. And then later it becomes domestic and maybe accrues some upper class people later on toward the end of the Iron Age. I don't know enough to say yet. I'm still, waist deep in research all the time. But these are things I'm considering.
Absolutely. So for your research, are you having to rely primarily on published excavation reports? Do you have access to things like archaeological notes that maybe didn't make it through the publication process?
Yeah, there's a mountain of excavation reports. Anyone who deals with the topography and archaeology of Jerusalem has to wade through just a mountain of material, and a lot of it's still being published. So there were digs. Kathleen Kenyon, for example, dug there in the 1960s, and then another large dig on the Western Hill was Nachman Avigad's dig, an Israeli dig after 1967. And volumes from those excavations are still appearing. Some of the more recent excavations have been published in short order, pretty quickly after the excavation finished. And so, yes, it's sifting through all of that. It's also looking in the biblical material and getting into the critical commentaries and the journals, and because the project it aims at integration. Right. And so often archaeologists and biblical scholars don't really talk to each other. And, the geographical context may or may not be considered depending on which author you're reading. And so, yeah, I'm trying to triangulate a connection point between all of those things. And yeah, that's involved a lot of reading of various materials.
Thank you. And I'm aware that you're at the beginning of your research phase. So if this is not something that can be answered, just tell me. Will you be looking at things like line of sight and maybe the exclusion of light in certain parts of the city because of the new building projects, or are you trying to limit yourself a little bit more?
No, definitely. I think the more the more we can include physical aspects of Jerusalem, the better, in any study that deals with Jerusalem, because the city is and was a real place, right? And whether or not, wherever we situate a given biblical text, let's say, the city, more than likely, it was still produced in Jerusalem, or a lot of texts, reflect on Jerusalem. And so one example I could give is the most of the Bible was composed, let's say, very end of the Iron Age, toward the end of the Iron Age, and then in the centuries following. Whether or not the Western Hill, so the city was destroyed in 586 by Nebuchadnezzar, and whether or not the Western Hill was built back up immediately after the return from exile, most scholars think it wasn't. The evidence is that there's only several hundreds of years later. You still have this mass amount of ruins sitting on the Western Hill and this old wall that used to surround it. And so one question we can ask is, for residents of Jerusalem who are maybe living in the parts around the spring and the ancient core of the city, what did it do to them ideologically to be living in this kind of half-built city and looking up at these ruins of a city that once was. Excuse me. What does that interaction do in the mind of the residents of Jerusalem and in the biblical authors?
That's really fascinating. Thank you. What are your summer plans, and how will HAPS funding help you with them?
So I did an SBL, excuse me, I did a presentation at the Society of Biblical Literature a few years ago on Psalm 122. And this is one of those rare instances where the Bible comments on a physical aspect of ancient Jerusalem. And Psalm 122 is in a section within the book of Psalms known as the Psalms of Ascent. Most of your listeners will probably be aware of that. It's a collection of 15 Psalms that begins with the superscription, a Psalm of Ascents is usually how it's translated. And the question is, well, what are those doing? You know, how are they used? How is the book used? There's all kinds of ideas out there. One popular idea that I think people are moving away from now is that they were used in the pilgrimage festivals somehow to Jerusalem. It's possible. But Psalm 122 is the only one that really reads like a pilgrimage psalm, and it describes people going to Jerusalem and going to the temple in Jerusalem. In verse 3, it describes the city as a city which is built, excuse me, a city which is built compact together or bound firmly together, depending on your translation. And my paper is exploring, what does that phrase mean? What does it mean that the city is built compact together? The buildings were built closely together, like you see in current Jerusalem today? Or does it mean that the city was protected by a firm, well-built city wall? It's another example, possibility you see in the commentaries. But there's other options that emerge from the archaeology of the city and understanding the dual dynamic of the two ridges of Jerusalem, like I was saying earlier, the eastern ridge and the western ridge. So I want to dig deeper on this issue, and it dovetails with my dissertation quite well, and explore, because the psalm probably was written a little bit later, either while the Western Hill was built up or when it was in ruins but still visible. And so I want to explore if and how this kind of dual dynamic of Jerusalem may have been commented upon here by the biblical writer.
Interesting. Thank you very much. We have a question from William Aarons. Thank you so much for your donation. Can an accurate estimate of population and development be made from the earlier settlement of Mount Zion in contrast to the time of the return from the exile?
That's hard to say. As you might know, William, population estimates are difficult because what you do is take an occupied space, usually in hectares, and then multiply it by a density coefficient, and you get different density coefficients that are used. It doesn't always mean that it's an average, right? Because if you have a built up area of space, we don't know how dense it was, how dense the population was. So some writers will say the Western Hill was densely occupied and Jerusalem became a large metropolis. Others will say that it was more sparsely occupied. And so our understanding of the population estimate should be lower. I think we could do better population estimates later on, like in the Roman period, when it probably was more densely occupied. Yeah, it's difficult. And those are some of the factors involved.
I just realized I muted myself. It's tricky, right? I did a fair amount of archaeology at graduate school, and I think we did a couple of classes on like estimating population density, and there are so many variables, and the best you can do is the best guess. You can't get the kind of accuracy that I think most of us would quite like, really, if we could possibly make it work.
And even if you read the 19th century explorers, who came to Jerusalem, their estimates of, population estimates of the city are wildly divergent. And so, even if we're talking 200 years ago or 150 years ago, it's still something we have to wade through the data for.
And I realized that I probably should have asked, again, this question earlier. When we're looking at the topography of a city, is the elevation of specific buildings, like what's the significance of that? Obviously, it will vary across time and space. But when we're looking at the ancient Near East, are higher places typically reserved for specific functions?
That's a good question. There will be a chapter in my dissertation on this, and comparing Jerusalem to other cities, probably in the Levant, but in the ancient Near East more broadly. And I think typically what we see is, say, the main temple of a city, elevated to a high point. I wouldn't expect to see that in a lower portion of the city. That is what we think was the case with Jerusalem. The ancient core of the city is kind of clustered around a spring that I mentioned earlier on a low spur line of Jerusalem. And then today, what's the noble sanctuary, or the place where the ancient temples were built, the Jewish and Judahite temples, that's at a higher place, a higher location than the rest of the city of Jerusalem. So it seems to fit, although we don't have archaeology from the noble sanctuary Temple Mount for obvious reasons. But what I have to do is find other Levantine cities, say capitals of Ammon, Moab, and Edom, for example, in Transjordan, or examples from the Aramean kingdoms up north, maybe some good ones, and compare what we know from the archaeology of those sites to Jerusalem, and see if and how it matches or contradicts.
And this is kind of why I was asking, and I should have phrased this whole thing differently. My apologies. This was why I was asking about whether the buildings on the Western Mound were domestic, right? Because that, as a Near Eastern specialist, that strikes me as odd to have a high place with domestic, like not elite structures. Because it would be my assumption that would be a temple space or a palace space or something similar. This is probably impossible to answer. Are there any theories as to why the Western Mound wasn't used in this way before?
It just seems that, as far as I can tell, the population in Jerusalem was low enough in numbers that it wouldn't have expanded in that direction until a later period. So something had to happen, either natural growth, centralization of the Judahite kingdom. Maybe we can add some refugees to that, like I was saying earlier, which gives the need for expansion. And the Western Hill is the next natural place that you would expand the city, but it's very strange because between these two ridges, the east and west ridges, you have a pronounced valley that is not there today. It's been filled in, but it was there in antiquity. And so the city actually spanned this valley, and you have a crater, which may be referenced in the prophetic book of Zephaniah, chapter 1, as a mortar or a crater in the middle of the urban center of Jerusalem. It's very strange. And so, yeah, I'm trying to explore the strange topography and see what we can make of it.
That sounds very interesting. Thank you. We have another question. Shane says he has friends who dismiss most archaeological evidence as subjective. What can archaeology tell us, and how confident can we be in that?
That's a great question. I will answer from what I know, from what my training allows. So what you see in excavation reports, if you pick up the scientific publication, let's say at the end of an excavation, it will review all the evidence that was uncovered in the dirt, from pottery, types of pottery that were found, to metal objects and bone objects. It will even may even include more scientific analysis, like the residue inside of jars, or radiocarbon dating of seeds or something like this that were found on the site. All that is hard data. There's no getting around that, and it needs to be accounted for. The reports will also give you the elevation, the height at which different things were uncovered, and so you can compare them across the site, the levels at which different buildings or different key finds were unearthed. Where it begins to get subjective is when the excavators give a discussion and interpretation of the remains. They're giving meaning to what they've unearthed. Sometimes it's undeniable if you have an inscription, or if there's just a preponderance of evidence. and other times it's more subjective. So a good archaeologist will be able to read the conclusions in an excavation report, compare it to the hard data at the front, and see if there's a dissonance between the two. But yeah, that's how I would answer that.
I think that's an excellent answer. And I think it's worth emphasizing that archaeological evidence is not subjective. That is, there was a city here. We can see there was a city here. Here are all of the buildings that we have found. The subjective side is the human interpretation. And I would add that any field of research that relies on human interpretation, which is almost all of them, has some level of subjectivity, right? It's almost impossible to get around. And you can mitigate against it. You can be aware of your own biases. You can be aware of not coming to the data with your conclusions already, but you can't ever remove subjectivity from yourself. I don't think psychologically it can be done.
Mm-hmm.
What archaeologists and what researchers are doing is trying to come up with the most likely explanation to explain the hard data, the factual evidence that they have. So this idea that, oh, it's subjective, that you can explain it a million different ways. No, actually you can't. If you could explain it a million different ways, archaeologists would be doing that. If there is one overriding explanation, that the reason for that is that it is the explanation that most accurately and completely accounts for the data that people are working with.
Can I add one?
Yes, please go for it.
One more piece that may help answer that question. Archaeology aims to recover certain material, and that has to do with usually the recovery of cities or monumental architecture, evidence that shows human occupation, which is usually borne out in stone walls and other material. One field now that's suggesting that archaeology, consider a bit more broadly other kinds of evidence is looking at nomads in the ancient world, because their archaeological traces obviously can't be found. They lived in tents made of organic matter, and they didn't build structures out of stone in most cases. And so there's a subfield within archaeology right now that's really looking at the archaeology of nomads. And there are different sites where we can see them, but I think the studies in large measure are pointing people back toward texts where we see evidence of nomads, and looking at those as well.
Thank you very much. I think that's an important nuance. We don't have any additional audience questions. Was there anything else that you wanted to share before I let you go?
Just that I'm really glad this scholarship exists. I think it's important and really cool that it's a crowd-funded scholarship. And I appreciate the emphasis on trying to keep the humanities alive and get these studies out into the public. So thank you.
Oh gosh, you're welcome. Thank you for being willing to come on and talk about your research. I know that can be a little nerve-wracking on occasion, especially as a PhD student. So I greatly appreciate you coming and helping to educate all of us. Thank you again. I will be in touch at the end of the month with more information about what happens next.
Okay, thank you, Megan.
Bye, Chandler. Okay, that was Chandler. He is looking at the historical geography, there we go, of Jerusalem. And I really enjoyed talking about that. So I hope that you all did too. Thank you everyone who sent in questions. We have a few minutes before our next interviewee is scheduled to show up. So I'm going to briefly go over what HAPS is, because we usually have a couple of people who are like, who are you? What is this ridiculousness? What's going on? HAPS stands for Humans Against Poor Scholarship. It is a entirely crowd-funded research grant that I run, and we provide $2,000 grants to PhD students who are working on some aspect of the ancient Near East. That can be Hebrew Bible, that can be archaeology, Assyriology, Egyptology. I'm missing one. What am I missing? No, I think maybe that was it. But we also fund people or consider people for funding who are maybe classicists, but classicists working on an interaction with Egypt. As long as it is related to the ancient Near East, you can apply to HAPS. And the fun thing, or one of the many fun things about HAPS, is that everybody who supports us, everybody who sends in a donation, gets to vote on the research that they want to see funded. So we're interviewing, I think, 20 PhD students this month. Once interviews are done, I will be sending an email to everyone who has donated to us with links to the interviews and a link to vote for the research that they want to see. And based on that voting, that's how we choose the PhD students who get the funding. And then after the summer, after the students have carried out the research that they were planning on carrying out, they come back and tell us how their summer went, what progress they made, and what their next steps are. And I love it because I always learn something new and interesting. So if you are interested and you want to donate, you can donate as little as $1. It's hapsfunds.com/donate. We are going to take a brief break just until our next student arrives. We are scheduled to start in 8 minutes. So 8 minutes, go get a cup of tea, stretch your legs, come back for another 20, 30 minutes of archaeological and Hebrew Bible excitement. Hello, everybody. We are back. We are going to have our third and final interview of the day with Tyler. Tyler, hi. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's nice to meet you. Could you just introduce yourself, tell everyone who you are, where you are, and what your speciality is?
Yeah. So my name is Tyler Moser, as you can see maybe on my name here. I am a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin, Hookham. And I specialize in ancient Near Eastern studies, the Hebrew Bible, and I'm working my way toward a dissertation applying disability studies to the study of the Hebrew Bible. Not exactly sure how it's going to look, but that's the direction.
That's the end goal.
So.
Sounds beautiful. Thank you. Are you interested in a particular book or a particular area of the Hebrew Bible, or is it kind of more of an amorphous thing at the moment?
I spend most of my time trying to study wisdom in various capacities. So like the book of Proverbs, the book of Job, Ecclesiastes. There is, an internal debate, as scholars have sometimes, about what counts as wisdom books, what counts as, wisdom literature. But I've spent the most time with the book of Proverbs. And so, I would be very much wanting to keep doing that in the future. But I've researched, I've also spent quite a bit of time in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. And so that's also a possibility.
Thank you. For those who are maybe not aware, could you just tell us what disability studies is?
Yeah, well, I can try. Disability studies is, the researching and looking at, particularly for me, looking at literature, ancient cultures, with an eye for how did those ancient people think about disability, or did they? And that's, tied in with a lot of other kind of pursuits of what did they think was ideal? What did they think was normal? How did they characterize or talk about people that fell outside of what they thought was normal? And making an attempt to find the disabled in the ancient world, because we know that they were there. We have a lot of archaeological and a lot of inscriptional and other evidence to know that disabled people were there. And so making an attempt to look at literature from that lens to see, were they ever explicitly talked about? And if they were, how were they, how were they talked about? How, were they outcasts? Were they hated? Were they, did they live in inclusive societies? Or how does this particular book talk about a particular disability? So how were the blind viewed in ancient Greece? As a very popular topic. For me, I have been working in the book of Proverbs and trying to think about how the book of Proverbs might actually help us understand the way that ancient Israelites, those who produced the book of Proverbs, how they might have thought about or talked about cognitive disability and people with cognitive disability. So that's something I've been spending a lot of time on. But disability studies in general is looking at culture, looking at literature, media, and trying to think through those critical questions of what's being presented as normal, and how do people who fall outside of that standard, whatever the standard might be, how are they talked about? How are they viewed? How are they portrayed? And what are they able to do in those societies?
Thank you very much. When you're looking at Proverbs, and I'm asking these questions well aware that you are at the beginning of your research and you might not be able to answer what I'm asking. When you look at the book of Proverbs, are there explicit statements that you can use, or is it more of a detective game where you're trying to peel apart layers and find references that are not so explicit?
So yeah, sometimes it is that. Sometimes it is wondering, okay, this phrase might be taken, could be taken to mean cognitive disability, or could be taken to mean, this or that. And I think that's one kind of piece of the puzzle. But there have been scholars that have done work on the Book of Proverbs, and they notice that in the Book of Proverbs there are actually certain quote unquote fools. Proverbs uses a lot of different words for fool that you might read in an English translation, but they notice that sometimes a fool actually isn't held morally responsible for their bad actions. And so Proverbs will talk about, the fool has his eyes on the horizon, and that's all it says, and indicating that this person might, their cognitive, state might be such that they don't focus on things, and they are, perceived as spacey, quote unquote, that we might say. And so noticing the lack of holding a certain kind of fool accountable in the Book of Proverbs is really what started me on the hunt, I guess you could say, for how they might think about cognitive disability. And then I came across another kind of, I guess, a way of approaching the Book of Proverbs called sensory criticism, which was developed by a scholar named Hector Avalos, who recommends or suggests that one way to get at finding or researching disability in the Hebrew Bible is to think about how they talk about the senses. How do they talk about the sense of sight? How do they talk about the sense of hearing? And more importantly, how do they talk about those that fall outside of those sensory functions? And so he spends his time looking at the book of Deuteronomy, and he argues Deuteronomy is audiocentric. It puts hearing at the very center of its vision for an ideal community, and in doing so, it suggests that deafness is kind of outside of this ideal vision for the religious community. And so I tried to do that in the Book of Proverbs, and what I found was that when Proverbs criticizes the fool, or when it contrasts wisdom with foolishness, what it does is it contrasts foolish behavior with knowledge. And so in doing that, it kind of puts knowledge and intellectual or practical know-how at the center of its vision for a good world, a well-ordered society. And in doing so, when it contrasts foolishness, whether it's referencing a person with cognitive disability explicitly, which I think there are some cases that it might be, but whether in each case it is, I think the overriding point that it contrasts foolishness with knowledge gives us a little bit of insight into how they understood people with lesser cognitive ability, at least in the Book of Proverbs.
Thank you. I wanted to briefly return to what you said about how there are several different words that are translated as fool or foolish into English. When you look at Proverbs in Hebrew and you're considering accountability of these, whether these fools are held morally accountable, do you see the same words being used for people who are not held accountable, or is it other words used across the spectrum?
Yeah, so that is the interesting part, is that you do find a pretty regular distribution. There's a certain kind of fool, the avil, I would say, who's always held accountable, and he's presented as essentially somebody who's willfully ignorant. He knows what he's doing is wrong. He doesn't care that it is. He's just going to do it anyway. But then there's two other kinds of fool, the kasil and the petit, which they get translated a lot of different ways because interpreters are trying to be responsible in drawing out differences between these terms. But those two, especially the petit, they never get held morally accountable, at least not to the same degree. There might be some debatable verses here and there, but for the most part, the petit is looked at as somebody who doesn't know better, and that's not necessarily their fault. Whereas the kasil is seen as somebody who is sometimes talked about as not necessarily responsible for their misdeeds because they don't know better. But the kasil tends to be framed in terms of, but they can learn, they can learn wisdom, or they can learn to do better. And so I think that tracking with that distribution also helps at least me, or at least supports my theory that that the Book of Proverbs is making a comment on intellectual ability and cognitive disability when it's making these kinds of statements.
Do you have a sense for how many times Proverbs talks about people with maybe cognitive disabilities?
So the last time I've gone through kind of the occurrences of these terms, I'd say it's probably less than 10 times. I would say I'd be willing to argue like that's definitely a reference to somebody with cognitive disability. But perhaps maybe 20 times around there might be a debate. And then the broader point about using cognitive ability as kind of a metric for what's wise, that's throughout the book. That's I would argue it's almost every time it contrasts wisdom with foolish behavior. It's banking its argument on that valuation of cognitive disability, or cognitive ability is really what enables a person to be wise. And if they don't have it, they're either they're willingly rejecting it, or they're lacking the ability to do it.
And do you see the same kind of variation in words used to talk about wisdom as you see in words used to talk about fools?
There is some, but yeah, it's not quite as varied. So chokmah is the main word that's used throughout, and Proverbs does play around with more religious language like righteousness and wickedness, and so that is a part of its framework too. But when it's talking specifically about wisdom, there's not too much variation in terms of there's a specific kind of wise person, and it distributes in the same way that there's multiple kinds of fool. Yeah.
And I know you've been concentrating primarily on Proverbs, but do you have a sense of whether this distribution is the linguistic distribution is similar across the rest of the wisdom literature, or is Proverbs like a special or a distinct case maybe?
Now that's something I need to do a little more work on in terms of coordinating Proverbs' usage with other biblical books. The Petit, they do show up at various places in the Hebrew Bible, and I would, I think often they're treated, relatively similarly, but foolishness, or avil and kasil, the two other kinds of fool, it's not as clear to me that the rest of the Hebrew Bible makes as clear of a distinction between the two. And obviously it's debatable within Proverbs itself whether it always makes that distinction as well.
Thank you. What are your plans for the summer, and how would HAPS funding help you?
Yeah, so my plans for the summer are rest. I'm coming to the end of a semester.
It's a good plan.
Cumulative exhaustion is setting in, so looking forward to that. But I have 3 children, because I have a family, so spend some time with our family. And then in terms of my summer plans regarding my research, I'm hoping to prepare or finish a paper that I've written on the Book of Proverbs and cognitive disability, to pursue all these kind of loose ends that I have in the paper, and not only to prepare it for presentation at the Society of Biblical Literature conference that's taking place in November, but ultimately, hopefully to submit it to a journal for publication. And so I think the HAPS scholarship would help in a number of ways. I think practically it would free me up to be able to focus on the research. It would enable me to be able to, or at least would help me be able to take my family to California for about a month where my wife's parents live, where we can have more help with childcare and things like that. And in California, there's a quite a nice library that's close by to their house that I would love to have access to as I'm continuing to work on this. And then just on a more personal level, I think as a first generation college student, from my own perspective growing up, I have no business pursuing PhD work, no business doing scholarship. Getting funding from organized bodies like this just increases my motivation and increases my desire to do good work, because it demonstrates to me that people are interested in what I'm doing. People believe in my work as a scholar, and so that's another huge way that a HAPS scholarship would help. Is it would help motivate me and encourage me as I start my summer plans to do research. So
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I have to say, as someone with multiple small children currently running around my house, the importance of childcare when you're a PhD student and a parent really shouldn't be overstated.
Yeah.
People leave programs all the time because they have no childcare and it's impossible to do both adequately. I left my program for that reason. We had no childcare, and I can't be a PhD student to the level that I would like to be, and also a good parent without that additional support. So having funds available is one of the reasons why we made HAPS a no strings attached fund, because we want people to be able to do things like go and stay with family members or pay for daycare, because actually that's a crucial part of being able to work is knowing if I go to the library for the next 8 hours, I don't have to worry about what are my children doing. I can just go and work, essentially. So I think that's both a very valid use of grant funds and a very important use of them. And I say that because very occasionally we get comments about people having issues with this. And I just want to make it perfectly clear that no, childcare is a very valid, legitimate use of grant money. And I think I say that in all of the publicity that I do for it. This is very, very necessary. So necessary. And I have to say, I think kind of more necessary than things sometimes like funding to travel to conferences, because there are other funds available for conference travel. Usually, well, often conferences will have discounted rooms for people who are presenting, or will have travel funds for graduate students. They almost never provide childcare.
Yeah, that's right.
And with funds that are available for students to just apply to, a lot of the times you have to submit receipts to get reimbursed for what you've paid for, and daycare receipts are typically not reimbursed. So
yeah, and it does take a while.
That's a little soapbox of mine. So I don't have any additional questions. The audience doesn't have anything else. Was there anything that you would like to share with us before I let you go?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to share some of what I'm working on, some of what I'm passionate about. Something I wasn't able to share earlier is that one of the reasons that I'm so interested in disability studies isn't just because the disabled have typically been ignored in scholarship of ancient cultures, and in reconstructing the past. The disabled tend to not show up as often as kings and other people, which in part for good reason, because kings are mentioned more often and they tended to have more political cachet. But it's not just because I want to help us as a field of ancient researchers be able to tell the story of the past in the most accurate way, but it's also because as somebody who has belonged to religious communities of faith, I've seen the ways that some of these texts can be wielded against disabled people. I've seen the way that some religious communities can become inaccessible to disabled people, and if I can, I want to help as much as we can understand the what those texts are talking about, and in part to help religious communities of faith who currently use those texts for religious purposes, help them to use those texts responsibly in a way that's inclusive for all people, and disabled people in particular.
I think both very important and admirable goals. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And for people watching, if you are interested in disability studies, we have an interview. I can't remember what the title of the interview is. I'll put a link about disability studies in Egyptology. It's a fascinating field. It's a very important, very valid field. Mm-hmm. And I'm honestly thrilled that people are taking it seriously and taking it into the Hebrew Bible, because you're right, the Bible is used in very many ways to exclude and to other people when I don't believe it should be. So thank you for this.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you again for coming and talking about your research, Tyler. I will be in contact in the next couple of weeks and let everyone know the next steps.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Tyler. Bye. That was Tyler. He is working on disability studies and Proverbs, the Hebrew Bible, Proverbs. Fascinating interview, as always. I love this. I always say this after every single, when we close out all of our interviews. I love this. It's wonderful and fascinating, and I get to hear about all the really, really interesting things people are doing. So if you are interested in this, we will be back tomorrow at 12 p.m. EDT with, I think, 2 or 3, let me check, 2 or 3 more interviews. 3 more interviews, all on some aspect of the Hebrew Bible, all current PhD students. So please do come back, listen to their research, ask questions if you have questions. If you would like to be able to vote for who receives the funding that we have available, please go to hapsfund.com/donate. Even $1 will get you a vote. We don't give more votes to people who donate more. We are very egalitarian here at HAPS. So please go donate if you would like to have a say in where this money goes, or if you just feel like funding some research. I mean, it's not something you get the opportunity to do every day as fund PhD students. So I think it's worthwhile just to do, because research is interesting and valuable. I am going to go and rescue my husband from the 3 small children who are currently shouting at him, because no one enjoys being shouted at by 3 small children all at once. And if maybe one of them can shout at me, one of them can shout at him, and one of them can shout at the cat, then everyone will be a lot happier than they currently are. So thank you all for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure to share this last, hour and a half with you all. Come back tomorrow. I will see you then, and have a delightful evening, afternoon. I don't know what today is. Enjoy it, whatever it is.